The silence within the stone tower was not an absence of sound, but a heavy, velvet presence that seemed to have settled over centuries of forgotten research. Outside, the mountain peak was being slowly erased by a relentless blizzard, a white tide that blurred the boundary between the jagged earth and the darkening sky. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ancient parchment, dried lavender, and the metallic tang of cooling copper. A single candle flickered on the edge of a massive oak desk, its flame bowing low whenever a draught managed to seep through the thick granite walls. The light danced across the spines of leather-bound volumes, highlighting titles written in languages that had long since faded from the tongues of men. Every shelf was a landscape of dust and wisdom, where the weight of the books seemed to anchor the very floorboards to the mountain itself. In the corner, a massive hourglass stood as the only witness to the passing night. The sand did not fall with a rush, it trickled with a hypnotic, liquid grace, each grain a microscopic shard of time being returned to the earth. There was no clock to strike the hour, only the rhythmic expansion and contraction of the tower's stones as they succumbed to the deep frost. The warmth from the hearth was a flickering heartbeat, casting long, wavering shadows that climbed the arched ceiling like the fingers of a weary giant. On the desk lay a scatter of tools, a silver quill, a jar of crushed cinnabar, and a magnifying lens that caught the amber light, distorting the world beyond its glass into a swirl of soft, golden fire. The air felt still, a stagnant pool of peace where the frantic pulse of the world below could never reach. Here, at the summit of the world, the only requirement was to exist within the stillness of the stone. Moving deeper into the laboratory, the transition from the library was marked by a shift in the air, which became cooler and redolent of damp earth and wood smoke. The center of the room was dominated by a vast table of beaten copper, its surface etched with the stains of 1,000 experiments, each a dark map of past curiosity. Glass retorts and long-necked flasks sat in wooden racks, their bellies filled with liquids that moved with the sluggishness of honey. Some were clear as mountain springs, while others held the deep, bruised purple of a sunset or the clouded gray of a winter morning. A slow, rhythmic dripping echoed from a cooling coil, a metronome for the soul that measured the heartbeat of the distillation process. Each drop hit the surface of a collection jar with a soft, resonant uplink, sending ripples across a surface that was as smooth as polished obsidian. The alchemist's tools were laid out with a ritualistic precision that spoke of a lifetime spent in pursuit of the quietest truths. A mortar and pestle of heavy green marble sat amidst a pile of dried rose petals, their scent releasing a faint, floral ghost into the room with every subtle movement of the air. The shadows in the rafters seemed to pulse in time with the glowing embers of the furnace, where a low, blue flame licked at the base of a ceramic crucible. There was a profound sense of safety in this isolation, a feeling that the mountain had wrapped its rocky arms around the tower to protect the delicate balance of the work within. The frost on the window panes had grown into intricate, fern-like patterns, crystallizing the silence of the blizzard into a physical barrier. Inside this cocoon of copper and stone, the only movement was the slow crawl of a shadow or the occasional pop of a cooling ember. The world was being reduced to its primary elements: heat, cold, and the infinite patience of the dark. To the left of the copper workbench stood a tall, narrow cabinet of dark walnut, its drawers labeled with faded ink and sealed with the brittle wax of many forgotten winters. Each brass handle was a cool ring that seemed to hum with the residual energy of the minerals stored within, a silent vibration felt only by a hand that moved with absolute deliberation. Inside one drawer, the fine, crystalline powder of a crushed sapphire sat in a small ceramic dish, catching the dying amber light of the hearth and reflecting it back as a ghost of the midnight sky. It was a silent blue spark amidst the earthy browns and charcoal greys of the laboratory, a reminder of the brilliance that existed far above the blizzard. The air here felt heavier than in the library, weighted by the presence of lead, tin, and the dense aromatic oils of ancient juniper and frankincense. Every movement of the shadows against the granite wall was a slow, deliberate dance, a silhouette that mirrored the steady, unhurried pace of the transformation taking place deep within the ceramic crucible. There was no need for speech in this sanctuary. The language of the room was spoken in the hiss of cooling metal, the soft, papery rustle of a turning page, and the rhythmic, muffled sigh of the wind as it unsuccessfully battered the stone turret walls. On a high shelf, a row of sealed jars contained the essences of summer storms and spring dawns, their contents now stilled into a permanent, liquid sleep, waiting for a distant morning that was still many long hours away. The glass of the jars was thick and slightly green, distorting the hearth's light into emerald patterns that crawled across the stone floor like slow-moving vines. To remain here was to be shielded from the frantic ticking of the world's clocks, as the tower existed in a fold of time where the only measure of progress was the gradual, steady accumulation of frost on the outer stones. The silence was a physical weight, comforting and absolute. A spiral staircase of cold, grey basalt led downward from the laboratory, winding into the silent, stone throat of the mountain where the air grew even more ancient and still. Each step was worn smooth by the passage of silent years, a path carved directly into the living rock that felt as solid and eternal as the peak itself. Down here, the scent of the upper rooms faded, replaced by the deep, mineral smell of wet stone and the faint, sweet aroma of aging wood from the massive storage vats. These lower chambers were the hidden archives of the work, where the results of 1,000 distillations sat in rows of stone niches, undisturbed by the changing seasons or the howling winds above. The light from a handheld lantern cast a warm, golden sphere that pushed back the velvet shadows, revealing the intricate, damp textures of the cave walls where water had once carved its own slow, geological history. There was a profound sense of descent, not just into the earth, but into a deeper state of being where the pulse of life slowed to match the heartbeat of the mountain stone. The silence in these depths was absolute and heavy, a comforting blanket that muffled even the most persistent thoughts of the day, leaving only the rhythm of the slow breath. In the center of the lowest vault sat a massive block of uncarved obsidian, its surface reflecting the lantern's glow like a dark, frozen lake hidden from the sun for eternity. It was a focal point of absolute stillness, a reminder that at the core of all change lies an unchanging foundation of peace. The walls seemed to vibrate with a low, subaudible frequency, the resonant, deep song of the mountain as it settled into its winter slumber. Every breath taken in this subterranean sanctuary felt like a draught of pure, cool silence, a restorative air that filled the lungs and stilled the heart completely, anchoring the soul to the quiet earth. Returning to the upper laboratory, the alchemist's stool, a sturdy tripod of blackened iron and weathered oak, sat positioned before a circular window that looked out into the chaotic white heart of the storm. The glass was thick and slightly warped by age, turning the snowflakes into frantic, ghostly streaks that seemed to be trying to find a way into the absolute stillness of the room. On the workbench, a small silver balance scale sat perfectly level, its twin pans holding a measure of white sand and a single, dried leaf of mountain sage. The sage released a sharp, cleansing aroma that cut through the heavier, metallic scents of lead and sulfur, a green memory of the high summer meadows that now lay buried under 10 feet of ice and silence. There was a profound sense of equilibrium in this sight, the fragile plant matter balancing perfectly against the weight of the earth's cold minerals. The walls of the tower seemed to hum with a low, grounding resonance, a sound that was felt in the center of the chest more than heard by the ears. It was the sound of the mountain resisting the wind, a deep, tectonic growl that had remained unchanged for 1,000 years. A row of hand-blown glass spheres hung from the rafters by thin copper wires, each containing a different vacuum-sealed element that shimmered in the hearth's amber glow like captive stars. One held a swirling mist of mercury, another a cluster of translucent sulfur crystals, and a third was filled with nothing but the pure air of the summit. These elements swayed with a slow rhythm, a celestial mobile that tracked the subtle shifts in the Earth's magnetic pull and the heavy rotation of the planet. To watch them was to feel the world's slow spin, a movement that was perfectly countered by the absolute solidity of the granite floor beneath. The laboratory was no longer just a room, it was a vessel of stone, a ship sailing through a silent sea of white darkness, guided by the steady light of the alchemical fire. The alchemist picked up a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed by the breath of 100 winters and stiff with the spills of forgotten tinctures and silver solutions. The ink on the pages was a deep, sepia brown, a meticulous record of observations made during nights exactly like this one, when the world outside had ceased to exist entirely. The writing was a dense, intricate script, a forest of symbols and numbers that sought to map the unseen currents of the soul and the secrets of the stone. A heavy brass compass lay across the open book, its needle pointing north toward the frozen heart of the pole, unmoving and resolute in the dim light. In this room, the north was not just a direction, it was an anchor, a fixed point in a universe that was constantly shifting and dissolving into the white void of the blizzard. The heat from the furnace had reached a perfect, steady state, a dry warmth that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the bones and still the blood. It was the kind of heat that made the eyelids heavy and the breath slow, a physical embrace that promised safety and absolute rest. On the far wall, a tapestry of heavy, ancient wool depicted a dragon consuming its own tail, the ancient symbol of the cycle of life and the infinite return of the seasons. The once vibrant reds and golds having softened into the colors of a dying autumn forest. The fabric moved slightly as a faint draft brushed against it, a slow wave that made the dragon appear as though it were breathing in its sleep. There was no conflict in this room, no struggle for dominance, there was only the quiet, patient observation of the elements as they moved toward their natural conclusion. The tower was a sanctuary of entropy, a place where the chaotic energy of the storm was distilled into the pure, crystalline essence of peace. Every object, from the smallest vial to the heaviest stone, had surrendered its identity to the collective stillness. A small, ceramic stove in the corner of the room held a pot of brewing tea, the steam rising in a thin, perfectly vertical line that eventually vanished into the velvet shadows of the high rafters. The tea was a private blend of dried roots, mountain berries, and a hint of wild honey, its aroma earthy and sweet, a liquid comfort that mirrored the steady warmth of the hearth. The alchemist poured a cup into a vessel of thick, unglazed clay, the sound of the pouring liquid a soft, splashing music in the absolute quiet of the night. Each sip was a journey into the heart of the mountain, a taste of the deep minerals and the cold, pure water that fed the ancient roots of the world. The cup was warm against the palms, a small, captive sun held in the hands that chased away the last lingering chill of the blizzard. Outside, the wind howled a new, higher note, a sharp whistle that vibrated against the copper chimney, but inside, the air remained undisturbed and heavy. On a shelf near the circular window, a collection of seashells sat in a bed of fine white sand, their spiral shapes a testament to a distant, warmer world that seemed like a fever dream in this frozen height. They were smooth to the touch, their surfaces polished by the tides of 1,000 years, now resting in the absolute stillness of the stone tower. To hold one to the ear was to hear the roar of a phantom ocean, a sound that merged with the sighing of the mountain wind to create a symphony of isolation and peace. The laboratory was filled with such contradictions, the sea in the mountains, the fire in the ice, the ancient wisdom in the fleeting moment of a breath. These elements did not fight, they coexisted in a delicate, shifting harmony that was maintained by the alchemist's silent attention. Every object in the room had its permanent place, a coordinate in a map of stillness that led directly to the center of a restorative and permanent rest. The center of the laboratory featured a large, circular stone basin, filled to the brim with a liquid that was as dark and reflective as a starless, winter night. This was the alchemist's mirror, a pool of pure, distilled water that had been treated with a drop of silver nitrate to capture the subtlest movements of the flickering light. To look into its glassy surface was to see the entire room inverted, a world of shadows and amber fire that seemed more real than the stone walls themselves. A single, microscopic dust mote fell into the basin, creating a ripple that expanded outward with a slow, geometric precision, a visual echo of a thought dissolving into a peaceful mind. The surface eventually settled back into its absolute, glassy state, a perfect horizontal plane that marked the center of the tower's gravity. The walls around the basin were etched with astronomical charts, the constellations of the winter sky carved into the granite and filled with powdered gold. Orion and the North Star shimmered in the low light, a permanent galaxy that watched over the work with a cold, distant benevolence. The room felt like a bridge between the deep earth and the high heavens, a middle ground where the laws of both worlds were studied and respected. The alchemist's shadow fell across the charts, a dark, elongated shape that seemed to be part of the stone itself, unmoving and eternal. There was a sense that the work had been going on for an eternity, and that it would continue long after the blizzard had faded and the mountain had crumbled into the sea. This continuity was the source of the room's deep peace, a feeling that nothing could ever truly be lost, only transformed into a different, quieter state. The air was now so still that the only sound was the rhythmic expansion of the alchemist's lungs, a slow, steady tide that rose and fell in time with the flickering fire. Near the base of the winding staircase, a small alcove held a collection of ancient musical instruments, their strings stilled by the weight of the years and the thick, protective dust. A lute of pearwood, its surface cracked like a dry riverbed, and a flute carved from a swan's wing bone sat together in a case of velvet and cedar. They did not play, yet they seemed to hold the memory of every song ever heard in these high rooms, a latent music that vibrated in the air like a ghost. The cedar wood released a faint, spicy scent that mingled with the smell of the mountain stone, a fragrance of ancient forests and long-lost summers. The alchemist's hands, calloused by the handling of stone and glass, moved over the instruments with a reverence that was almost a prayer. To touch the wood was to feel the vibration of the wind outside, the tower acting as a giant resonator that amplified the low, grounding hum of the mountain. There was a profound sense of craftsmanship in every object, a dedication to beauty that was not meant for an audience, but for the sake of the work itself. This integrity was a physical force in the room, a pillar of strength that supported the heavy stone ceiling and the weight of the blizzard above. The laboratory was a place where the ego was dissolved into the materials, where the seeker became the sought, and the work became the worker. Every grain of salt, every drop of mercury, and every spark of fire was a participant in this great, silent drama of existence. The shadows in the alcove were deep and cool, a retreat within a retreat where the mind could finally surrender its last remaining attachments to the world. The journey downward into the earth was now matched by a journey inward into the self, a double descent that led to a single, unified point of absolute and restorative silence that filled the entire tower with grace. A heavy, iron-bound chest sat at the foot of the alchemist's bed, its surface carved with scenes of a harvest that had long since been consumed by time. Inside lay the linens of the night, blankets of heavy wool, sheets of cool, unbleached flax, and pillows stuffed with the dried petals of hops and chamomile. These materials were the final tools of the great work, the vessels for the ultimate transformation from wakefulness into the alchemical gold of sleep. The bed itself was a frame of massive oak, anchored to the stone floor by its own immense weight, a safe harbor in the heart of the storm. The blankets felt like the earth itself, a heavy, grounding pressure that signaled to the body that the time for action had passed. The scent of the chamomile rose from the pillows in a soft, herbal cloud, a fragrance that slowed the pulse and stilled the wandering thoughts of the day. Above the bed, the ceiling was a dome of smooth granite, reflecting the low, rhythmic pulse of the embers in the hearth like the roof of a sacred cave. There was no light here but the dying glow of the fire, a soft, amber radiance that made the room feel as though it were carved from a single, giant piece of sun-worn stone. The blizzard outside was now a distant, muffled roar, the sound of a world that no longer had any claim on the soul within. The tower was a cocoon of safety, a fortress of silence where the only law was the absolute necessity of rest. Every breath taken was a deeper surrender to the weight of the blankets and the ancient peace of the mountain peak. The alchemist watched the last spark of a cooling ember rise into the chimney, a final, glowing sign that the work of the day was complete and the work of the night had begun in earnest. In the center of the sleeping chamber, a small, circular table of polished obsidian held a single bowl of heated milk, infused with a pinch of crushed nutmeg and a drop of orange blossom water. The steam rose in a slow, lazy spiral, a white ghost that drifted toward the granite ceiling and vanished into the velvet darkness. The alchemist's fingers felt the warmth of the ceramic bowl, a comforting heat that signaled the final transition from the intellectual labor of the laboratory to the physical surrender of the night. Every sip was a warm tide that flowed through the body, relaxing the muscles of the shoulders and slowing the rhythmic pulse of the heart to a steady, grounding beat. Outside, the blizzard had reached its peak, the snow piling up against the heavy oak door in a silent, white drift that sealed the tower from the rest of the world. This isolation was not a loneliness, but a profound and chosen sanctuary, a fortress where the laws of the valley no longer applied. The walls of the tower, 3 feet of solid, ancient stone, held the warmth of the day like a living heart, radiating a gentle, infrared peace that softened the air. On a small peg near the bed hung a robe of heavy, UN-dyed wool, its texture rough and honest, a garment designed for the absolute stillness of the mountain peak. The alchemist moved with a deliberate, slow grace, every action a part of a sacred ritual that had been practiced for 1,000 winters. There was no hurry here, no ticking of a mechanical clock to drive the mind forward. There was only the natural expansion and contraction of the shadows as the fire breathed its last amber breaths. The room felt as though it were carved from the very silence of the stars, a place where time had finally folded its wings and gone to sleep. The alchemist sat on the edge of the massive oak bed, the weight of the body causing the wood to give a small, comforting creak that echoed softly in the domed room. The floor beneath the feet was covered in a rug of thick, braided wool, its patterns a map of ancient paths that led through the dark forests of the mind. To touch the wool was to feel the grounding strength of the earth, a physical anchor that prevented the soul from drifting too far into the white void of the storm outside. The light from the hearth was now a deep, smoldering red, the color of a sunset captured in stone and held captive for the night. It cast long, wavering shadows that climbed the walls like the hands of a weary giant, seeking a place to rest among the astronomical charts and the golden stars. The air was thick with the scent of the chamomile pillows and the fading smoke of the cedar logs, a fragrance that acted as a gentle weight upon the eyelids. Every breath was now a conscious act of letting go, a release of the day's observations and the laboratory's complex calculations. The mind was no longer a seeker of secrets, but a vessel for the quietude of the mountain, a stone basin reflecting the infinite dark. The alchemist lay back against the pillows, the heavy blankets rising to the chin like a warm, protective tide that carried away the last vestiges of effort. There was a profound sense of completion, a feeling that the great work had reached its natural, silent conclusion for this cycle of the sun. The tower was a ship of stone, sailing through the vast, white darkness of the cosmos, guided only by the steady, internal light of a peaceful heart. Every grain of sand in the hourglass had finally come to rest at the bottom, and the silence of the tower was now absolute, a golden treasure more valuable than any alchemical metal. The darkness in the sleeping chamber was now a living velvet, a soft and heavy presence that seemed to absorb even the faintest crackle of the dying hearth. The alchemist felt the weight of the wool blankets as a deep, structural comfort, a physical anchor that signaled to every cell in the body that the journey of the day had reached its destination. Each muscle in the shoulders, once tense from the precise work of the laboratory, now surrendered to the steady gravity of the massive oak bed. The scent of the chamomile and hops rose from the pillows in a thick, invisible cloud, a herbal fog that settled over the mind and stilled the last flickering thoughts of the great work. Outside, the blizzard had become a silent, rhythmic pulsing, a white heartbeat that vibrated through the 3-foot-thick granite walls without ever disturbing the inner peace. This was the true alchemy, the transformation of a violent, chaotic storm into a profound and restorative silence within the stone vessel of the tower. The mind was no longer a seeker of secrets, but a dark, quiet pool of distilled water, reflecting nothing but the absolute stillness of the rafters. Every breath was a slow tide, rising and falling with the effortless grace of the mountain's own deep and ancient respiration. There was no past to examine and no future to calculate, there was only the immense, golden weight of the present moment, a sanctuary carved from the very heart of the winter night. The alchemist watched the last orange glow of a cooling ember through half-closed eyelids, a tiny, glowing sun that was slowly sinking into the grey ash of the world. The warmth was no longer something external, but a steady, internal radiance that filled the chest and radiated outward to the tips of the fingers. The air in the tower had reached a perfect, unchanging equilibrium, a temperature that felt like a warm embrace from a world that had forgotten how to move. The shadows on the granite ceiling were no longer wavering, they had become solid, dark anchors that held the room in a state of permanent grace. The alchemist's pulse had slowed to match the rhythmic dripping of the cooling coil in the laboratory above, a liquid metronome that measured the vast, empty spaces between the stars. To exist in this state was to be part of the stone itself, a conscious element within the mountain's immense and silent architecture. The heavy linens against the skin were the only physical boundary left, a soft cocoon that protected the soul as it prepared to drift across the threshold of the deep, alchemical sleep. Every grain of sand in the great hourglass of the world had found its resting place, and the movement of time had been replaced by the immense, static weight of eternity. The tower was no longer a place of work, but a hollowed-out space in the cosmos where the noise of existence could never hope to enter. The alchemist felt the eyelids close for the final time, a heavy curtain falling over a world that had been perfectly distilled and understood. There was a profound sense of trust in this darkness, a knowledge that the mountain would stand guard and the fire would continue to smolder in the heart of the stone until the first light of a distant spring. The journey was complete, the vessel was sealed, and the spirit was now free to wander through the vast, quiet landscapes of the inner dream. In this absolute stillness, even the memory of the storm began to fade into a soft, white blur, leaving only the warmth and the weight of the night behind. The final vibration of the mountain wind seemed to dissolve into the very grain of the granite walls, leaving a silence so absolute it felt like a physical presence pressing gently against the skin. The alchemist was no longer a person observing a room, but a part of the room's own deep and ancient memory, a single, quiet breath in the vast, sleeping lungs of the peak. The weight of the heavy wool blankets was the weight of the earth itself, a grounding force that pulled the last remaining traces of consciousness into the soft, dark soil of the inner world. Every cell in the body had surrendered its individual spark to the collective warmth of the hearth, a slow-burning ember that would glow in the heart of the stone until the stars themselves grew weary and dim. The laboratory above, with its copper imbix and leather-bound scrolls, was now a distant galaxy, a constellation of tools that had completed their sacred purpose and found their eternal rest. There was no more salt to measure, no more mercury to distill, and no more ink to spill upon the yellowed pages of the night. The great work was not a gold that could be held in the hand, but this very state of being, a crystalline, unbreakable peace that existed far above the reach of the valley's frantic and shallow noise. The alchemist felt the boundaries of the self begin to blur, melting into the scent of the chamomile, the warmth of the oak bed, and the infinite, white darkness of the blizzard outside. The tower was a ship of stone that had finally found its harbor, dropping an anchor of basalt into the deep, silent waters of the cosmic ocean. Every breath was a soft wave receding from a distant shore, carrying away the names of things and the shapes of thoughts until only the pure, golden essence of existence remained. There was no longer a need to seek, for the seeker had become the stillness itself, a permanent and restorative sanctuary in the heart of the winter night. The work was finished.